Hello, and welcome to Lanternlight Chronicles. Tonight, let the day come to rest. Let the noise of it fall away behind you, one small worry at a time, until there is nothing left to hold. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let your breathing slow and deepen. And let me carry you a very long way from here, across desert and across time, to a hidden valley in the mountains of southern Jordan, where a whole city was once carved directly into the living rock, and then, slowly and quietly, forgotten by the world. Picture it now, in the cool gray hour before dawn. You are walking along the floor of a narrow canyon. The walls rise on either side of you, higher and higher, until they nearly close overhead, leaving only a thin ribbon of paling sky far above. The stone around you is not the dull brown of ordinary rock. It is banded and swirled with rose and amber and honey and deep wine red, layers laid down grain by grain across unimaginable ages. And even in this dim light it seems to hold a soft inner warmth, as though the mountains themselves were made of something closer to sunset than to stone. Your footsteps are muffled in the sand. The air is still and faintly cool against your face. Somewhere high above, a bird you cannot see calls once and falls silent. The canyon bends and bends again, so that you can never see very far ahead, only the next curve of glowing rock and the next pool of shadow. And with every step the walls seem to lean a little closer, until you feel as though you are walking not through a landscape at all, but along a corridor inside the earth, a passage worn smooth by water and wind, and by the feet of countless travelers who came this way long before you were born. Then the canyon narrows to its tightest point, a slot barely wide enough for a loaded camel to pass. And through that slot, framed like a picture in a doorway, something begins to appear. At first it is only a sliver of pale gold, catching light that has not yet reached the canyon floor. Then, as you walk forward, it grows. A column. Then another. The curve of a great carved pediment. And finally, as you step out of the shadow, the whole face of it stands revealed before you, rising sheer out of the rock. An enormous temple front, more than 40 meters tall. Its columns and figures and crowning urn, all cut directly into the cliff by human hands, glowing now the color of a rose held up to candlelight. This is the building the world would come to call the treasury. And it is only the threshold. Behind it, hidden in these mountains, lies an entire lost city. Tonight, we are going to walk into that city together, and into the story of the people who built it. We will ask who they were, these desert wanderers who somehow became one of the richest peoples of the ancient world. We will find out how they coaxed water out of a land that had almost none, and how that single secret allowed a city to bloom where a city should never have been able to grow. We will follow the long caravans of frankincense and myrrh that made them wealthy. And we will watch as they carved their homes and their temples and their tombs straight into the mountainsides. We will stand in the great city at the height of its glory, and then we will watch, very gently, as the trade routes shift, as the earth itself trembles, and as the sand begins its slow and patient work of swallowing everything the Nabataeans made. And at the very end, we will follow a single young traveler, many centuries later, as he slips into these mountains in disguise, and gives the lost city back to the world. There is no need to remember any of it. There will be no test in the morning, and nothing here you must hold on to. If your mind drifts, let it drift. If you fall asleep before we reach the end, that is not a failure. That is exactly what this is for. I will still be here, telling the story softly, and the city will still be waiting in the dark, patient as it has always been. If you find that these quiet histories help carry you toward rest, you might gently tap the like button and perhaps subscribe, so that more of them can find their way to you and to others who lie awake at night looking for something calm to hold. That is the only thing I will ask of you all evening. And now, we can let the modern world fall away entirely and go back across more than 2,000 years, to the beginning, to the empty desert and the wandering people who would one day call this valley home. To understand Petra, you must first understand the land that holds it, because everything about the city, its triumphs and its sorrows alike, was shaped by the hard and beautiful country in which it stood. Imagine a vast stretch of the earth, lying between the Dead Sea to the north and the Red Sea to the south, a country of mountains and desert in what is today the Kingdom of Jordan. It is a place of enormous skies and enormous silence. In the daytime the sun presses down on the rock, with a weight you can almost feel, and the horizon shimmers with heat. At night the temperature falls away swiftly, and the desert grows cold and clear, and the stars come out in numbers that a city dweller can scarcely believe, spilled across the black like sugar across a table. This is not soft country. Rain falls rarely here, and when it comes it often comes all at once, in sudden violent storms that send water roaring down the dry valleys and walls of brown flood, only to vanish again within hours, and leave the land as parched as before. For most of the year the stream beds are dry channels of sand and stone. The plants that survive are low and tough and thorned, clinging to what little moisture they can find. To cross this country you must know where the water is. For water is life here in the most literal sense, and a traveler who does not know the way can die of thirst within sight of mountains. And yet, in the middle of this hard land, there is a place of strange shelter. Among the mountains there lies a broad basin, ringed almost entirely by high cliffs of that rose and amber sandstone, reachable only through a handful of narrow clefts in the rock. It is as though nature had built a fortress here, and left just a few secret doors. Within the basin the ground is more forgiving, and springs rise here and there from the base of the cliffs. And for a few precious weeks in spring the higher slopes turn faintly green. A place like this, hidden and defensible and touched by water, is rare beyond price in the desert. It was here, in this natural stronghold, that the city of Petra would one day rise. But long before there were carved temples or paved streets, there were only the wandering people who first learned to love this valley, the Nabataeans. We do not know exactly where the Nabataeans came from, and in a way that mystery suits them, for they were a people who kept their secrets well. They seem to have drifted up out of the deserts of Arabia, many centuries before the birth of Christ, moving north and west with their herds and their tents. They spoke a form of the old Arabian tongue, though for writing they came to use a version of Aramaic, the common language of the ancient Near East, and from their flowing script would one day descend the very letters in which Arabic is written to this day. They left us no long histories of themselves, no epics of their kings, no careful chronicles of the kind the Greeks and Romans loved to write. What we know of them we have pieced together from the scattered mentions of their neighbors, from inscriptions carved on rock, and above all from the astonishing things they built and left behind. The earliest clear glimpse we have of them comes from around 312 years before the Common Era. In that year, one of the generals who had carved up the empire of Alexander the Great after his death, a man named Antigonus, decided that these desert people and their growing wealth were worth taking. He sent an army against them while their men were away at a great gathering, hoping to catch their stronghold undefended and carry off their treasure. And here we learn something important about the Nabataeans, for the raid failed. The desert people came storming back, fell upon the heavily laden Greek soldiers as they retreated slowly across the sands, and destroyed nearly all of them. When a second expedition was sent, the Nabataeans simply sent a calm and reasoned letter of protest, and the Greeks, having learned their lesson, withdrew and left them in peace. This is our first portrait of the people of Petra, and it is a telling one, shrewd, mobile, fiercely capable of defending their home, and already, even then, rich enough to be worth robbing. For in truth the Nabataeans had discovered something more valuable than any gold mine. They had made themselves the masters of the desert roads. Across the great emptiness of Arabia there moved a river of trade, and the Nabataeans learned every bend and crossing of it. They knew where the hidden wells lay. They knew how far a camel could walk between one water source and the next. They knew which passes were safe and which were haunted by raiders. And so the merchants of the ancient world came to depend upon them, and to pay them handsomely, first as guides and protectors, and then as middlemen and masters of the trade itself. Slowly the wandering herders became something new. They became the great carriers of the desert, and the wealth of that trade began to pool in their hidden valley among the rose-colored cliffs. But wealth alone could not have built Petra. A city cannot live on gold. A city must drink. And here, in the most unlikely of places, the Nabataeans performed what may be their single greatest act of genius. One so quiet and so practical that it is easy to walk past it without a second glance. And yet without it nothing else that we will see tonight could ever have existed. In a land that received only a few centimeters of rain a year, in a valley that should by every reasonable measure have supported only a scattering of tents, the Nabataeans learned to gather and hold and command water so completely that they made the desert bloom. Consider the problem they faced. When rain did come to these mountains, it did not fall gently and soak into the earth to be drawn up later. It fell in sudden torrents, and because the rock could not absorb it, that water gathered with terrifying speed into the narrow canyons, and came racing down as flash floods, deadly walls of muddy water that could sweep away anything in their path. So the very rain that should have been a blessing arrived instead as a danger, spending itself in a few violent hours and then draining uselessly away into the sand. To live here, the Nabataeans had to solve two opposite problems at once. They had to protect themselves from too much water all at once, and they had to save that same water so they would have it during the long dry months when there was none at all. And solve it they did, with a patience and cleverness that still astonishes the engineers who study their work today. All across the mountains around their city, they carved and built an enormous, invisible machine for handling water. On the high slopes they cut channels into the rock to catch the runoff from every rainstorm and guide it, gently and deliberately, down toward the city. They built dams across the mouths of side valleys to slow the floods and force the water to give up its burden of silt. They shaped great open basins and sealed underground cisterns, plastered watertight. Some of them large enough to hold the drinking water of thousands of people through an entire dry season. And they lined the whole system with pipes, thousands of sections of fired clay pipe, each fitted carefully into the next, running along the canyon walls and beneath the streets, carrying spring water into the heart of the city, with just the right gentle slope, neither so steep that the water would rush and burst the joints, nor so shallow that it would sit and stagnate. Perhaps the most beautiful stroke of all was what they did to the great canyon that formed the main entrance to their city, the narrow winding gorge through which you and I walked at the very beginning of tonight's journey. That canyon was a natural funnel for flash floods, and a single storm could turn it into a drowning trap. So the Nabataeans built a dam across its upper end, and cut a tunnel through the solid rock to divert the floodwater away into a neighboring valley, keeping the entrance safe and dry for the caravans and the pilgrims who passed through it. They turned their greatest danger into a managed, obedient thing. When you understand this, the city changes before your eyes. Those rose-red cliffs are not merely beautiful. They are the walls of a vast and subtle waterworks, tended for centuries by people who understood their harsh homeland better, perhaps, than any people has ever understood the land beneath its feet. Now let us follow the wealth itself, for it came from very far away, and its story is one of the most fragrant in all of history. In the southern corner of Arabia, in the lands we now call Yemen and Oman, there grew, and still grow, certain twisted, unremarkable-looking trees. Wound the bark of these trees, and they weep a pale resin that hardens in the sun into small golden tears. Two of these resins, above all others, were treasured throughout the ancient world beyond almost any other substance. One was frankincense, whose smoke, when burned, fills the air with a sweet and solemn perfume. The other was myrrh, bitterer and darker, used in medicine, in perfume, and in the anointing of the dead. to the peoples of the ancient Mediterranean. These were not luxuries but necessities of the sacred. No temple could honor its gods without incense rising from its altars. No great funeral could be conducted without myrrh. Kings burned frankincense by the pound, and the demand for it never ceased. But the trees grew only at the far southern edge of Arabia, and the temples that hungered for their smoke stood a world away, in Egypt and Greece and Rome and the cities of the Levant. Between them lay nearly 2,000 kilometers of some of the most forbidding desert on earth. And across that terrible distance, the precious resin had to travel by the slow and swaying steps of the camel, in long caravans that might take 2 months or more to make the journey. This was the great incense road, and whoever controlled its northern reaches, whoever could guide and water and protect those caravans as they came up out of the deep desert toward the sea, would grow rich beyond the dreams of ordinary men. And that is precisely what the Nabataeans did. Petra sat at the crossing point, the place where the long desert road from the south met the routes running west to the ports of the Mediterranean and north to Damascus and the cities of Syria. The caravans had to pass this way, and when they did, they stopped in the hidden valley to rest, to water their animals at the great cisterns, to trade, and to pay. Imagine one of those caravans arriving. For weeks the merchants and their camels have crossed the open desert, sleeping under the stars, rationing their water, watching the horizon for raiders. They are burned by the sun and coated in fine dust, and their beasts are footsore and lean. And then, at last, they come through one of the narrow clefts in the mountains, and before them opens the sheltered valley, green at its edges, loud with the sounds of a living city, and everywhere the smell of water and cooking and animals and the sweet trace of the very incense they carry. Here they can rest in safety. Here there are markets and craftsmen and money changers, temples to give thanks in, and cool dark chambers cut into the rock where a weary man can escape the heat of the day. To such travelers, coming in off the killing emptiness of the desert, Petra must have seemed less like a city than like a vision, a rose-colored mirage that did not vanish when you drew near. The Nabataeans grew wealthy on this trade, and as their wealth grew, so did their ambition to make their city magnificent. And here we come to the thing for which Petra is famous above all else, the thing that sets it apart from every other city of the ancient world. For the Nabataeans did not, for the most part, build their grandest works by stacking stone upon stone. They carved them. They took the living cliffs that surrounded their valley, those great smooth faces of rose and honey sandstone, and into them they cut their temples and their tombs and the ornamented fronts of their sacred places, hollowing the mountains into architecture, sculpting the very bones of the earth. To carve a great facade into a cliff is a strange and difficult art, quite unlike ordinary building, and the Nabataeans mastered it completely. They did not begin at the bottom, as you might expect. They began at the top. First their masons would climb to the height where the topmost point of the facade would stand, and there they would cut footholds in a working platform into the rock. Then, working downward, they would carve away the cliff face, shaping the cornice, then the columns, then the doorways, then the lower details, always cutting from the top down, so that they never had to stand upon or damage the finished work below them, and so that the debris fell away beneath their feet. It required perfect planning, for there could be no second chance. A cliff cannot be uncarved. A mistake in the stone was a mistake forever. And yet again and again they cut these enormous fronts, some of them the height of a modern apartment building, with clean columns and delicate ornament and crowning shapes, and got them right. The stone itself both helped and hindered them. Sandstone is soft enough to carve with iron tools, far softer than granite or marble, and this is what made the whole endeavor possible. But it is also crumbling and fragile, and its beautiful swirling bands of color are also lines of weakness, and its surface weathers and flakes in the wind and rain. Fine, crisp detail carved into sandstone does not last as sharply as detail carved into harder stone. And so much of what the Nabataeans made has softened over the centuries, its edges rounded, its faces blurred, as though the whole city were a sculpture slowly melting in the desert air across the span of 2,000 years. There is a particular poignancy in this, a sense of grandeur being very gradually reclaimed, that hangs over the ruins even now, and gives them much of their strange and dreamlike beauty. And of all the things the Nabataeans carved, the greatest and most famous stands right at the threshold of the city, at the very spot where you and I emerged from the shadowed canyon at the beginning of the night. The building the world now calls the Treasury. Its true name, its Nabataean name, we do not know. The name we use, the Treasury, comes from a much later legend, and we will come to that. But first, simply stand before it again in your mind, and let its scale settle over you. It rises more than 40 meters up the cliff face, wider than a great house. Its lower level a row of tall columns with a triangular pediment above, and its upper level a stranger and more dramatic composition, with a round tower in the center, flanked by 2 half pediments. And everywhere among the columns the softened figures of gods and mythical beings, carved from the same rose stone. At the very top stands a great stone urn, and it is this urn that gave the building its name and its legend. For long after the Nabataeans were gone, the Bedouin people who lived among the ruins told a story about that urn. They said that a great pharaoh of Egypt, fleeing through the desert with all his treasure, had used his magic to conjure this building out of the cliff, and had hidden his gold inside the stone urn at its summit, high out of reach. And so the building became, in the local tongue, the treasury of the pharaoh. Over the generations, hopeful people fired their rifles up at the urn, again and again, trying to shatter it and bring the hidden gold raining down. You can still see the pockmarks their bullets left in the ancient stone. But of course there was never any gold. The urn is solid rock, carved from the same cliff as everything around it, and the treasure was only a dream. What the building truly was, most scholars now believe, was a tomb, and very likely a royal one. Perhaps it was the resting place of one of Petra's greatest kings, its magnificent front meant to proclaim, to every traveler who came in weary off the desert road, the wealth and power and confidence of the people who ruled this hidden valley. If so, then the very first thing a visitor to Petra ever saw was a monument to death, made unspeakably beautiful, glowing rose and gold in the morning light. And somehow that feels exactly right for this city, where beauty and mortality were carved forever into the same stone. But the treasury, for all its fame, is only the doorway. Walk on past it now, in your mind, and let us go deeper into the city. For beyond that first great facade the canyon opens out, and Petra unfolds before you far larger than any first-time visitor expects. The path continues past the treasury and widens, and the cliffs on either side become a gallery of carved fronts. Tomb after tomb after tomb, some plain and some richly ornamented, their dark doorways opening into cool chambers cut back into the rock. This was, in part, a city of the dead as much as of the living, and the Nabataeans lavished extraordinary care on the houses they made for those who had passed on, cutting family tombs into the cliffs where generations could be laid to rest together. Their entrances facing out over the streets where their descendants still walked and traded and prayed. Then the way opens into a broad natural theater of space among the mountains, and here stood the true heart of the living city. Down its center ran a grand colonnaded street, paved with stone, lined on either side with rows of columns, and along it stood the markets, and the public buildings, and the temples where the daily life of Petra was carried on. Picture it now not as a silent ruin, but as it once was, crowded and loud and alive. Merchants call out from beneath awnings, their stalls piled with goods from half the known world, spices and cloth and pottery and glass, incense and perfume, and Dead Sea salt, and bitumen, copper and silver, dates and grain, camels groan and shuffle. Water runs, always, in the channels along the streets and splashes in public fountains. That most extravagant of all things in a desert, water running freely in the open air, a constant quiet boast of the city's mastery over its harsh land. Somewhere a craftsman taps at a piece of the fine, thin, delicately painted pottery for which the Nabataeans were famous. Some of the most beautiful ceramics of the entire ancient world, so thin it is almost translucent, painted with feathery designs in a reddish brown. Rising above the street stood the great temples, built now not only by carving, but by conventional building too. Stone laid upon stone, and faced with columns in the grand manner of the age. The largest of them all, which we now call simply the Great Temple, was a vast complex of walls and colonnades, and a broad terraced forecourt, climbing up the lower slope of the mountainside, large enough to have held a great crowd of worshippers or citizens. Nearby stood another temple, beautifully preserved, that the Bedouin later called the daughter of the Pharaoh's palace, a solid roofed building whose walls still stand to their full height, one of the very few structures in Petra that did not have its roof, and so stayed whole across the centuries while so much else fell. These temples were the setting for the great public rituals of the Nabataean year, the festivals and processions and sacrifices through which the people honored their gods and knit themselves together as a community. And carved into the mountainside near the center of the city was a great theater, a semicircle of seats hewn, once again, directly out of the living rock, rising row upon row up the slope, able to seat many thousands of spectators. When the Nabataeans wished to attend a performance, they climbed and settled into seats cut from the same stone that formed the mountains around them, and watched the players below with the rose cliffs and the deep desert sky as their backdrop. There is something wonderful in imagining it. A crowd of desert people gathered in the cool of an evening, in a theater carved out of a mountain, in a city that should not have been able to exist, laughing and weeping at a play while the water they had so cleverly gathered ran quietly through the channels beneath their feet. Away from the grand public street, the ordinary life of the city carried on in humbler ways. Most of the people of Petra did not live in carved tombs or grand temples, of course, but in houses, some built of stone in the open valley, and others cut back into the softer rock of the lower slopes, cool caves fitted out as homes, with hearths and storage jars and sleeping platforms. There were workshops where the famous pottery was thrown and fired, where metal was worked, where the goods of the caravan trade were sorted and repacked. There were the humble, essential trades of any city, bakers and weavers and leather workers, and the men who tended the vital cisterns and channels. And all of it, rich and poor, sacred and ordinary, was held together and made possible by that hidden machinery of water, tended day after day, year after year, so that a city of perhaps 20 or 30,000 souls could drink and cook and wash and worship in the middle of one of the driest places on the face of the earth. To understand the people who lived here, we must also try to understand what they believed, for religion ran through every part of their lives as surely as the water ran through their channels. The Nabataeans worshipped a number of gods, but chief among them was a deity called Dushara, whose name seems to mean the Lord of the Mountain, a god associated with the high places, with strength and sovereignty, and the very rock of which their city was made. Beside him they honored a great goddess, most often called Al-Uzza, a goddess of power and of the morning star, and other divine figures besides. But the way the Nabataeans pictured their gods was, at least in their older tradition, strikingly different from the way the Greeks and Romans pictured theirs. Where the Greeks carved their gods as perfect human beings, in marble flesh and flowing robes, the Nabataeans, in their earliest and purest devotion, represented their gods not as people at all, but as simple standing blocks of stone, plain rectangular pillars they called bedels, meaning houses of the god. A block of the living rock, set upright, sometimes with only the faintest suggestion of eyes and a nose, was enough to hold the presence of the divine. There is a stark and powerful simplicity in this, a sense of a God who is not a magnified man, but something older and more elemental, dwelling in the stone itself. In time, as Greek influence flowed in along the trade roads, the Nabataeans began also to carve their gods in more human form, and the two ways of seeing the divine came to stand side by side, the old stone pillars and the new sculpted faces, in the temples of the same city. The most dramatic of all their sacred places lay high above the city, at the summit of one of the surrounding mountains, reached by a long stairway cut into the rock, hundreds of steps climbing up and up out of the valley. This was the high place of sacrifice, a broad platform leveled at the very top of the world, open to the enormous sky, with altars cut from the living stone and channels carved to carry away the blood of the offerings. To climb those stairs was itself an act of devotion. Leaving the crowded valley below and ascending into the silence and the wind and the vast light of the heights, until at last you stood on the summit with the whole rose and amber wilderness spread out beneath you in every direction. There, under the open sky, the priests made their offerings to Dushara and the other gods. And the smoke of the sacrifices rose up from the mountaintop into the clear desert air. Even today, to climb those same worn steps and stand on that same high platform is to feel something of what the ancient worshippers must have felt. A smallness before the immensity of sky and stone, and a nearness, perhaps, to whatever it is that dwells in high and silent places. Let us turn now to the kings who ruled over all of this, for by the time Petra reached its height, it was no longer a loose gathering of desert traders, but a true kingdom, with a line of monarchs, a court, an army, and a place among the powers of the ancient Near East. We do not know the names of the earliest Nabataean chiefs, but by a couple of centuries before the Common Era their rulers had begun to call themselves kings, and their names begin to appear in inscriptions and in the writings of their neighbors. Many of them bore names that echo down the generations of the dynasty, names like Aretas and Obotus and Malichus and Rabel, repeated from father to son and king to king across the centuries of Nabataean rule. One of the greatest of the early kings was Aretas III, who ruled in the decades before the middle of the 1st century before Christ. He was a ruler of wide ambition, so admiring of the brilliant Greek culture that flowed through his lands along the trade roads that he took to calling himself the lover of the Greeks. And under him the Nabataean kingdom pushed its power northward, even taking control for a time of the great and ancient city of Damascus. He was the first Nabataean king to strike his own coins, those small discs of silver stamped with his image and his name, a proud declaration to the world that here was a sovereign to be reckoned with, the equal of the Greek kings whose culture he so admired. Under rulers like him, the wealth of the incense trade was turning steadily into the stone splendor of the city, tomb by tomb, temple by temple, as generation after generation of Nabataeans carved their confidence and their prosperity into the everlasting cliffs. But the greatest age of all, the true golden noon of Petra, came under a king named Aretas IV, who ruled for nearly half a century, from a few years before the birth of Christ until around 40 years after. His people gave him a beautiful title. They called him the one who loves his people, and by every sign we have, the long years of his reign were the richest and most magnificent in the whole history of the kingdom. It was under Aretas IV, most scholars believe, that many of Petra's greatest monuments took their final form, quite possibly including the great treasury itself. Trade flowed strong along the desert roads. The population of the city swelled. The waterworks reached their fullest and most sophisticated extent. Nabataean pottery, that exquisite thin painted ware, reached the height of its beauty. The kingdom stretched from deep in the Arabian desert, north toward Damascus and south toward the Red Sea, and its ships and caravans and agents carried its goods across the whole eastern Mediterranean world. If ever there was a time to have walked the colonnaded street of Petra and seen the city in its full glory, water running in every channel, the cliffs freshly carved and still crisp with detail, the markets overflowing with the goods of 3 continents, it was in the long reign of Aretas, the one who loved his people. The kings of Petra did not rule alone, either. The Nabataeans gave a striking prominence to their queens, far more than most peoples of the ancient world. The names and images of the royal women appear beside those of the kings on the coins and in the inscriptions, honored as partners in the royal power, and this too tells us something about the character of this desert people, something a little different from the rigid patterns of the great empires around them. They were, in so many ways, a people who did things in their own manner, shrewd and independent, and quietly confident, keeping their own counsel, guarding their trade secrets and their desert roads, and building, always building, their impossible city among the rocks. Yet no kingdom in that part of the world could remain entirely free of the shadow of the greatest power of the age, and that power was Rome. Even at the height of Petra's glory, Rome was rising in the west and reaching ever further east, swallowing kingdom after kingdom, until the whole rim of the Mediterranean had become, in one way or another, subject to the will of the Roman state. The Nabataeans watched this rise with the same shrewdness they brought to everything, and for a long time they managed the danger with great skill, remaining formally independent while carefully avoiding any direct challenge to Rome, paying their respects, offering their friendship, and quietly going on with the profitable business of the desert trade. They were caught up at times in the tangled affairs of the neighboring kingdom of Judea, whose most famous ruler, Herod the Great, had Nabataean blood on his mother's side, and a long and quarrelsome relationship with his desert neighbors. Aretas IV himself gave one of his daughters in marriage to a son of Herod, a marriage that would end badly and lead to war between the two kingdoms. A small and bitter conflict fought out along their shared borders. The Nabataeans even appear briefly in the pages of the New Testament, for it was under an official of King Aretas that the Apostle Paul, according to his own account, was once nearly captured in Damascus, and had to be lowered over the city wall in a basket to make his escape. Through such small windows, we catch fleeting glimpses of Petra taking its part in the great drama of the ancient world. But the long independence of the Nabataeans could not last forever, and in the end it came quietly to a close, not with a great battle or a burning city, but almost as an administrative act. Around the year 106 of the Common Era, in the reign of the Roman Emperor Trajan, the kingdom of the Nabataeans was formally annexed and absorbed into the Roman Empire, becoming a new Roman province with the simple, sweeping name of Arabia. The last of the independent kings passed from the scene, and Petra became a Roman provincial city, ruled now from afar by the machinery of the empire. There seems to have been little or no fighting. Perhaps the Nabataeans, ever shrewd, judged that resistance was hopeless, and that they had more to gain by joining the empire peacefully than by dying to oppose it. And at first, the change may have seemed to bring little but benefit. Rome brought order, and roads and investment. A great new highway, the road they called the Via Nova Traiana, was driven through the province, running the length of it, and linking Petra and its sister cities into the vast network of Roman roads that bound the empire together. The city was adorned with new buildings in the Roman style. For a while, under the Roman peace, Petra remained wealthy and important. A jewel of the eastern frontier, its rose-red monuments now flying, in a sense, the eagle of Rome. But even as it wore this new imperial splendor, the deep tide that would carry the city into the dark had already, silently, begun to turn. Before we follow that turning tide down into the twilight of the city, let us linger a little longer in Petra at its height, and try to feel what it was truly like to live there, in the ordinary hours of an ordinary day. For it is easy, when we speak of trade routes and kings and empires, to forget that this was a place where people simply lived, where children were born and grew, where families ate their evening meals and lovers met, and old friends argued in the shade. The Nabataeans, for all their genius with water and stone, were not so very different from us in the things that filled their days. Among the most surprising discoveries that archaeologists have made in Petra is the evidence that, in the very center of this desert city, there was once a garden. Not a scrubby patch of desert plants, but a true ornamental garden, green and shaded, laid out beside the grand public buildings, and beside it a great open pool of water, with a little pavilion set upon an island in its middle. Think of what that means, and what it must have meant to the people who saw it. In a land where water was the difference between life and death, where a traveler might dream of it for weeks as he crossed the burning sands, the rulers of Petra built a pool, simply for beauty and for pleasure. A wide sheet of open water reflecting the rose cliffs and the blue sky, with a garden of trees and flowers beside it, kept alive by that same patient, invisible network of channels and cisterns. It was the ultimate display of the city's mastery over its harsh homeland, a way of saying, without a single word, that here in Petra even water, the most precious thing in the world, was so completely commanded that it could be spent on nothing more than delight. And the pleasures of Petra did not end at the garden's edge. The Nabataeans loved wine, and they grew grapes on terraces in the surrounding hills, coaxing vines to grow where the land seemed to forbid it, using the same clever methods of catching and guiding runoff water that had built their city. They kept flocks and grew grain and pressed oil, and the markets, as we have seen, overflowed with delicacies carried in from across the known world. They ate well, they drank well, and they feasted together at the great religious festivals, gathering in halls cut into the rock to share food and wine in honor of their gods and their dead. There is a warmth in this that reaches across the centuries, a sense of a people who worked hard and thought cleverly and lived, when they could, with real enjoyment, in the cool of their carved chambers under the enormous desert stars. Now lift your eyes once more to the mountains that ring the city, because there is one more monument we must see before the light begins to fail, and it is the grandest of them all. High above the valley, reached by a long, long stairway of some 800 steps cut into the living rock, winding up through clefts and along ledges to a lonely summit, there stands a carved facade even larger than the treasury. The Bedouin later called it the monastery, because in a much later age Christian monks or hermits seem to have used its great chamber and carved small crosses into its walls. But it was not built as a monastery. It was carved by the Nabataeans, most likely as a temple or a great hall for sacred gatherings, perhaps connected with the worship of one of their deified kings. It is enormous, its doorway alone tall enough to dwarf a person standing within it, its whole front some 50 meters across and nearly as high, cut cleanly out of the mountain in that same grand style. Its columns and central tower and crowning urn echoing the treasury far below, but on an even mightier scale. To reach it, you must make the long climb up the 800 steps, and the climb itself is part of its meaning. You leave the crowded floor of the valley and ascend, step by worn step, past smaller tombs and shrines, through narrow passages in the rock, higher and higher into the thinning air and the widening view, until at last you come out onto a high open space among the peaks, and there, facing you, is that colossal carved front, glowing gold in the light, utterly silent, with nothing behind it but the enormous emptiness of the desert falling away beyond the mountains. There is a particular feeling in standing there, so high above the city, before something so vast and so patient that is difficult to put into words. It is a feeling of the smallness of a single life, and the strange endurance of what human beings can make when they set their whole society to the task across generations. The people who carved this monument have been gone for the better part of 2,000 years, and yet here their work stands, unmoved, catching the same sun that it caught when their hands first shaped it. And this, in the end, is the great and quiet theme of all of Petra, the meeting of what passes and what remains, of the brief lives of the builders and the long life of the stone. For the whole valley, you must understand, is like this. It is not one monument or two, but hundreds, spread across a vast rugged landscape of canyons and cliffs and hidden high places. There are grand royal tombs with facades like temples, and humble family graves cut into low rock. There are shrines and altars, staircases and processional ways, water channels and cisterns beyond counting. There are chambers where feasts were held for the dead, and niches where the little stone gods once stood. A person could wander among them for days and not see them all. The Nabataeans wrote their whole existence into these mountains, their faith and their wealth and their love for their families and their reverence for their dead, until the very landscape had become a kind of enormous, silent book, waiting to be read by anyone who came after and had the patience to look. And for a long, glorious span of time, the city thrived, and the book grew, page by carved page. But now the light is beginning to change. Now we must turn, gently, to the slow and quiet story of how it all came to an end. For a while, under Roman rule, Petra even took on a new kind of splendor, dressing its ancient bones in the fashions of the empire. The Romans loved grand civic architecture, and the great street that ran through the heart of the city was paved anew and lined with columns in the formal Roman manner. A proper colonnaded avenue of the sort found in Roman cities all across the East. A monumental gateway was raised across it, and public fountains, and the city was given the trappings of a Roman provincial town, its Nabataean heart now beating beneath a Roman dress. The emperor himself honored the province, and for a time Petra bore the proud style of a metropolis, a leading city of the region, its name and its dignity recognized by the masters of the world. To walk its streets in those years would have been to see a curious and beautiful blending. The old carved cliffs of the Nabataeans rising above a street laid out in the crisp geometry of Rome. The incense of the ancient gods still drifting past columns of the imperial style. Two great traditions meeting and mingling in the rose-red valley. Yet beneath this new imperial finery, the deeper life of the city had already begun its slow ebb. For the thing that had truly made Petra great was never its buildings, but its place upon the roads of trade, and that place was quietly slipping away. The Roman peace that adorned the city with columns was the same Roman power that was opening the sea lanes and shifting the patterns of commerce. And the splendor of Roman Petra, real as it was, had something of the quality of a sunset about it, a last flare of brightness across the sky, even as the light itself was beginning to fail. The city was magnificent still. But the caravans, on which everything depended, were already growing fewer, and the long afternoon of Petra was drawing on toward evening. The decline of Petra was not a sudden thing, and that is part of what makes it so poignant. A city that falls in fire and slaughter dies a swift and terrible death, but its death is at least clear and quick. Petra died the other way, slowly, over long centuries, so gradually that no single generation could have looked around and said, "This is the end. We are the last." Instead, the greatness simply ebbed, a little in each lifetime, like a tide going out so slowly that you cannot see it move, until one day you look up and find that the water, which once lapped at your feet, has withdrawn entirely and left only bare and drying sand. The first and deepest cause of that ebbing tide was the thing that had made Petra great in the first place: the trade. The city had grown rich as the master of the desert roads, the place where the caravans of frankincense and spice were forced to pass and pay. But the patterns of trade are never fixed forever, and slowly, over the centuries, the great rivers of commerce that had flowed through Petra began to find other beds. As the Romans extended their power and their knowledge across the eastern seas, more and more of the trade in eastern goods began to travel by ship, rather than by camel, sailing up the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean, bypassing the long overland desert routes altogether. A cargo that once crawled for 2 months across the sands behind a swaying camel could now be carried far more cheaply in the hold of a ship. And a city whose entire fortune had been built upon the overland caravan trade could only watch as that trade, its very lifeblood, was drawn away toward the water. There was a rival on land, too, away to the north, in the Syrian desert. Another great caravan city had risen to challenge Petra for the mastery of the overland routes, the beautiful and ambitious city of Palmyra. As Palmyra grew in wealth and power, it drew more and more of the northern trade toward itself, and away from the older desert kingdom in the south. Between the ships on the Red Sea and the rise of Palmyra in the north, Petra found itself gradually squeezed out of the very business that had raised it from a gathering of tents into one of the wonders of the world. The caravans grew fewer. The markets grew quieter. The great cisterns, once filled to slake the thirst of thousands of travelers a season, were needed less and less. The city did not collapse. It simply began, ever so slowly, to matter less than it once had, to shrink back toward the size and the significance of an ordinary provincial town, its days of splendor gently receding into memory. And then, into this long, slow fading, there came a series of sudden and violent blows. Blows dealt not by any human enemy, but by the restless earth itself. For the land on which Petra stood, and indeed the whole region around it, lies along one of the great fracture lines of the earth's crust, a place where the ground is prone, from time to time, to shudder and heave in the terror of an earthquake. And Petra, that city so beautifully and so intricately built, so utterly dependent upon its delicate network of channels and pipes and cisterns, was cruelly vulnerable to such a shaking. The worst of these blows fell in the year 363 of the Common Era. In that year a mighty earthquake struck the region, an upheaval so severe that it damaged cities across a wide swath of the Roman East. Petra was devastated. Buildings that had stood for centuries came crashing down. Columns toppled. Walls split and fell. But the deepest wound was one that could not be seen at a glance, for the earthquake shattered the very thing upon which the whole life of the city depended, the hidden system of water. The channels cracked. The pipes broke apart. The cisterns split and leaked away their precious contents into the thirsty ground. And here was the terrible truth that lay at the heart of Petra's fate. The waterworks were what had made the city possible in the first place. They were the answer to the impossible question of how a great city could live in a place with almost no water. But that answer was fragile. It required constant, careful maintenance by a large and organized and prosperous community. People to clear the channels and repair the pipes and tend the cisterns, year after year, without fail. And a city already weakened, already shrinking, already drained of the wealth and the population that had once maintained it in perfect order, could not easily repair such enormous damage. Some of the system was patched and kept working, but much of it was never fully restored. And once the water began to fail, the desert, which had always been waiting just beyond the walls, began quietly to return. Nearly 2 centuries later, in the year 551, the earth shook again. Another great earthquake, striking the already diminished city, and bringing down more of what still stood. By now Petra was a shadow of its former self, and it had neither the wealth nor the will to rise again from this second ruin. The pattern of these blows tells the whole sad story in miniature. A city that is thriving can absorb a disaster, rebuild, and carry on, as Petra surely would have done in the days of Aretas, the one who loved his people. But a city that is already fading, already losing its purpose and its people, cannot. Each blow finds it weaker than the last, and each blow leaves it weaker still, until at last there is not enough left to rebuild at all. The earthquakes did not kill Petra by themselves. They were more like the illnesses that carry off someone already grown old and frail. The final causes of a death whose deeper roots lay in the long, slow withdrawing of the tide of trade that had given the city its life. Yet even in its long decline, Petra did not fall silent, all at once, and the centuries of its slow fading have their own quiet stories to tell. As the Roman world gradually gave way to the Christian empire we now call Byzantine, the old gods of the Nabataeans, Dushara and Al-Uzza, and the little pillars of stone, faded too. And the people who still lived among the rose-red cliffs turned to the new faith. In the very heart of the old city, on the slope above the colonnaded street, they built a Christian church, and they decorated it beautifully, laying down floors of intricate mosaic in which you can still see, worked in tiny colored stones, the images of birds and beasts, and the seasons of the year, and the personified figures of the ocean and the earth. For a time this church was clearly a place of some importance, the spiritual center of a community that, though much reduced, still clung to life in the ancient valley. Elsewhere among the ruins, the great carved monastery high on its mountain gained the crosses that would one day give it its name, cut into the rock by monks or hermits who found, in that lonely and magnificent place, a fitting retreat from the world. And it is from this Byzantine church that we have received one of the most extraordinary gifts that Petra has ever offered up to us. A gift that let us hear, faintly, the actual voices of the people who lived here in the city's twilight. For when that church at last burned, in some forgotten fire. A collection of documents that had been stored within it was not destroyed, but carbonized, scorched black and hard by the heat, but not consumed, and so preserved through all the centuries that followed, buried in the ruins. When archaeologists uncovered them, and, with immense patience and skill, learned to unroll and read these fragile blackened scrolls, they found not poetry or scripture, but something in a way far more precious: the ordinary paperwork of ordinary lives. Contracts, records of property, the settlement of a family's affairs, disputes over land and inheritance, the dry, human, everyday business of people living their lives in a real place at a real time, in the 6th century of the Common Era, in a Petra that most of the world had long since ceased to think of as a wonder. Through these scorched papyri, we glimpse a community that was still functioning, still marrying and inheriting and quarreling and settling, still recognizably a living town, even as the great age of the city receded ever further into the past. They are like a voice heard very faintly from the bottom of a deep well, the last clear words we have from the people of Petra before the long silence closes over them entirely. For after those last Byzantine centuries, the record grows thin, and then thinner, and then it fades almost to nothing at all. We do not have a single dramatic moment we can point to and say, "Here, on this day, the last citizen locked the last door and walked away from Petra forever." That is not how it happened. Instead, the town simply grew smaller and smaller. Families left, a few at a time, drawn away to places with easier water and better prospects, or dying out and leaving no one behind. The unrepaired channels crumbled further, the gardens withered, the pool dried to cracked mud, and then to dust. Sand, carried on the desert wind, drifted year by year against the bases of the great carved facades, piling up in the doorways of the tombs, filling the once proud street, softening every hard edge of the city under a slow and patient blanket. The buildings that had been built of stacked stone fell, block by block, in the tremors and the storms, until they were only tumbled mounds. And the great carved monuments, which could not fall because they were part of the mountain itself, stood on, but empty, their chambers dark and silent, their thresholds heaped with drifted sand, waiting for a life that would not return. There is a strange and gentle sorrow in imagining those last long centuries, the city emptying so gradually that no one within it ever quite believed it was ending. Picture the final few families, living among the ruins of a splendor they could scarcely comprehend, in a valley full of the tombs and temples of a people whose very language they may no longer have fully understood. To them, the great facades would have been simply the landscape, the way the mountains had always looked, carved with the works of the ancients, mysterious and half-explained by legend. Perhaps they told stories about them, as people always do about the ruins among which they live. Perhaps it was in these years that the tale first arose of the pharaoh's treasure hidden in the great stone urn. And then, at last, even these few were gone, and Petra passed out of the world of towns and cities altogether, and became something else, a haunted and beautiful emptiness, known only to the wandering Bedouin who moved through the region with their flocks, sheltering sometimes in the cool of the ancient carved chambers, watering their animals at whatever remained of the old cisterns, and keeping to themselves the knowledge of the hidden rose-red city among the rocks. And so Petra vanished. Not physically, for the mountains and their carvings remained exactly where they had always been, but had vanished from the mind of the wider world, dropped clean out of the maps and the memories of the great civilizations to the west. For century upon century, the merchants and scholars and kings of Europe, who read their ancient books and knew the names of the famous cities of antiquity, had no idea that this marvel still existed, standing whole and silent in its desert valley, waiting. The knowledge of Petra survived only among the local people who lived near it, and guarded their desert closely against outsiders. To everyone else, it was as though the city had never been, or had been swallowed entirely by the sands, another lost name from a lost age. And there Petra remained, hidden and forgotten, through the long, slow turning of more than 1,000 years, until at last. In a much later age, a curious and daring young traveler from a far country began to hear, in the coffee houses and camps of the desert, whispers of a wondrous ruined city that no European had ever seen. That young traveler was a Swiss man named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, and the story of how he found Petra again is one of the most quietly thrilling in the history of exploration. Burckhardt was a scholar and an adventurer, a man of extraordinary determination who had set himself the goal of exploring the lands of the Arab world at a time when they were all but closed to Europeans, and when to be discovered as a Christian outsider in certain regions could mean death. To prepare himself, he had done something remarkable. He had spent years learning the Arabic language until he could speak it with fluency, and studying the faith and customs of Islam until he could pass convincingly as a Muslim traveler. He grew a beard, adopted Arab dress, took an Arab name, and moved through the desert not as a foreign explorer, but in the guise of a learned man journeying through the lands. A disguise he maintained with such care and such nerve that it carried him safely through places no European had walked in living memory. In the year 1812, Burckhardt was traveling through the country of southern Jordan, making his way toward Egypt, when he began to hear the local people speak of astonishing ruins hidden in the mountains nearby, a place of carved palaces and temples in a secret valley among the cliffs. His scholar's heart must have leaped at the words, for he knew his ancient geography, and he began to suspect that these ruins might be the long-lost city of the Nabataeans, the Petra of the old texts, unseen by the outside world for more than 1,000 years. But he faced a delicate and dangerous problem. He was traveling in disguise, and the local people were deeply suspicious of the motives of any stranger who showed too keen an interest in the ancient sites. Fearing that such a man might be a treasure hunter, or a sorcerer, or a spy, come to carry off the wealth they believed the ruins to hold. If he revealed his eagerness to explore the hidden city, he would give himself away and put his whole journey, and perhaps his life, at risk. So Burckhardt devised a clever ruse. He announced that he had made a vow to sacrifice a goat at the tomb of the prophet Aaron, the brother of Moses, whose shrine, according to local tradition, stood on a mountaintop on the far side of the very valley where the ruins lay. It was a pious and unremarkable wish, exactly the kind of thing a devout traveler might undertake. And it gave him a perfectly innocent reason to be led into the hidden valley and through the heart of the ruins on his way to the holy mountain beyond. A local guide was found to take him, and so, with his goat, and with his eyes carefully lowered so as not to betray his excitement, Burckhardt was led toward the secret place. His path took him down into the narrow, winding canyon, that same shadowed gorge with its towering walls of rose and amber stone, through which you and I walked at the beginning of tonight's journey. And then, as the canyon reached its narrowest point, and he stepped through the slot in the rock, there before him, glowing in the light, rose the great carved front of the treasury. 40 meters of columns and figures and the crowning urn, cut clean into the living cliff, exactly as it had stood for 2,000 years. Burckhardt understood at once that he was looking at something extraordinary, one of the great monuments of antiquity, unknown to the entire scholarly world of his own time. But he could not stop. He could not stare. He could not take out paper and begin to draw and measure and record, as every fiber of his being must have longed to do. For to do so would have instantly betrayed him as an outsider with too great an interest in the place. So he walked on, through the astonishing valley, past facade after facade, tomb after tomb, temple after temple, drinking it all in with sidelong glances, committing what he could to memory, all the while playing the part of the ordinary pilgrim bound for the mountain of Aaron, his heart no doubt pounding with the effort of hiding the greatest discovery of his life behind a mask of calm indifference. He made only the briefest notes, in secret, and he was not able to explore the city fully, or to prove its identity beyond doubt. But he had seen it. He had walked the streets of Petra, the first man from the outside world to do so in more than 1,000 years, and he carried the knowledge of it safely out of the desert and back to the scholars of Europe. When his account was at last published, it caused a sensation. The lost city of the Nabataeans, swallowed by sand and forgotten for a millennium, had been found. And in the years and decades that followed, other travelers and artists and scholars made their way to the hidden valley, and they drew the great facades, and painted them, and measured them, and the fame of Petra spread across the world. An English poet, moved by the accounts of that rose-colored city rising sheer from the desert cliffs, gave it the phrase by which it is perhaps best remembered still, calling it a rose-red city, half as old as time. And so, through the courage and cunning of one young man in disguise, and through the wonder of all those who came after him, Petra was given back to the memory of humankind and took its place among the acknowledged marvels of the world, where it has remained ever since. Since those first travelers came, generation after generation of scholars and archaeologists has labored in the rose-red valley, clearing away the drifted sand of centuries, mapping the endless monuments, and coaxing the mute stones into telling their story. It is slow and painstaking work, and it goes on to this day, and with every season it reveals a little more of the people who built this place, while also, in the way of all deep inquiry, uncovering fresh mysteries to replace the ones it solves. The garden and the great pool in the heart of the city were unknown to the world until archaeologists uncovered their traces in recent decades, overturning the old idea that the center of Petra had been given over entirely to solemn public buildings, and showing instead that there had been beauty and pleasure and green shade there too. The delicate details of the water system, the exact fall of each channel, the capacity of each hidden cistern, have been traced and measured and marveled at by modern engineers, who confess that they are not sure they could have done better themselves with all the tools of the present age. And beneath the sand around the great treasury, excavators have found still more chambers and tombs, so that even that most famous of all the monuments, studied for 2 centuries, has not yet finished surprising us. And yet, for all that we have learned, Petra keeps a great deal of itself hidden still, and perhaps it always will. We still do not know for certain who was buried in the treasury, or exactly why it was built in that particular and dramatic form. We cannot read the full story of the Nabataean kings, because they left us no chronicles of their own. Only their coins, and their inscriptions, and their silent stone. We do not fully understand the older reaches of their religion, the meaning of many of their rituals, the names and natures of all their gods. We do not know precisely how large the city grew at its height, or exactly how its ordinary people lived and thought and felt about the extraordinary place they called home. The Nabataeans, who were so shrewd and so guarded in life, who kept the secrets of their desert roads so closely, have kept their deeper secrets in death as well. And there is something fitting in that, something that suits the character of the place. Petra is not a city that gives itself up all at once. It reveals itself slowly, as you walk deeper into it, one carved facade emerging from behind another. And even after you have seen it all, it holds something back, some final mystery that keeps it forever, a little beyond our full understanding. What we can say with certainty is that the Nabataeans were among the most remarkable peoples of the ancient world, and that their achievement deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous glories of Egypt and Greece and Rome. Think of what they accomplished. Beginning as wandering herders in one of the harshest deserts on earth, with no great river like the Nile to bless them, and no fertile plains to feed them, they built, by sheer ingenuity and patience and daring, one of the wealthiest and most beautiful cities of their age. They mastered the movement of water so completely that they made a metropolis bloom in a place that received barely any rain. They wove themselves so cunningly into the trade of 3 continents that the incense of the temples of the whole Mediterranean world passed through their hands. They developed a script that would give rise, in time, to the writing used by hundreds of millions of people today for the flowing Arabic alphabet, in which so much of the world's poetry and scripture and daily life is written. Traces its descent through the very letters the Nabataeans carved upon their rocks, and they blended the cultures that met at their crossroads, the Arabian and the Greek, and the Roman and the many peoples of the East, into something wholly their own, a civilization that looked in every direction and yet remained, unmistakably, itself. Their genius for the desert did not end at the walls of Petra. Either, far to the west and north, in the arid lands of the Negev, the Nabataeans spread the same clever arts of catching and guiding runoff water, building whole systems of walls and channels that turned barren hillsides into farmland, coaxing crops and vines from ground that looked as though it could support nothing at all. Long after Petra itself had faded, the knowledge the Nabataeans had won in their struggle with the desert lived on in these techniques, studied even now by those who wish to grow food in the dry places of the earth, so that in a strange way the wisdom of that lost people still reaches forward to help us with one of the great challenges of our own time. It is a fine thought to hold, that the patient cleverness of a vanished desert kingdom might yet teach the living something worth knowing. The Nabataeans are gone, but they were never merely a curiosity, never merely the makers of a pretty ruin. They were true masters of the difficult art of living well in a hard land, and there is a great deal in their long and quiet story that is worth carrying with us still. Now, before we come to the end of our journey, let us do one last thing together. Let us set aside the kings and the trade routes and the earthquakes, and let us simply go back, one final time, to Petra at the very height of its glory, and live a single ordinary day there, from the first gray light of dawn to the coming of the desert stars. There is nothing to learn in this. It is only a place to rest your mind, a slow walk through a city that was, so that you may carry its quiet with you down into sleep. It is very early, and the valley is still in shadow, though far above the topmost rim of the eastern cliffs has begun to glow. The air is cool and clean and carries the smell of wood smoke, for the bakers are already awake, and the first fires of the day are lit. Water runs softly in the channels along the edges of the street, as it always does, its gentle sound the constant undertone of the city, day and night. A rooster calls somewhere among the houses. A door opens. The first footsteps of the morning cross the paving stones, and slowly, as the sun climbs higher behind the eastern mountains, the light begins to pour down the great carved facades, moving down the rose-red stone inch by inch, and everywhere it touches, the rock seems to wake and warm and glow, as though the city itself were slowly opening its eyes. The morning fills with the sounds of a place coming to life. The markets are setting up along the colonnaded street, awnings unrolled against the sun that will soon grow fierce, stalls laid out with dates and bread and pottery and cloth. A caravan that came in late the night before is stirring in one of the open squares, the drivers checking their animals, unloading bundles of goods brought from far away, the camels grumbling and shifting in the cool. Priests climb the long stairways toward the high places to make the morning offerings. Water carriers move through the streets. Children, up before their parents can stop them, chase one another between the columns and are scolded and laugh and run on. And over all of it the sun climbs and the shadows shorten, and the great facades blaze brighter and brighter in the strengthening light, gold and rose and honey against the deep desert blue of the sky. By midday the heat lies heavy over the valley, and the pace of the city slows. This is the hour to retreat into the cool, and the cool is everywhere near at hand, for the whole city is threaded with chambers cut back into the rock, and to step from the glaring street into one of these carved rooms is to pass in a single stride from the fierce blaze of noon into a deep, shadowed, blessed coolness. The stone around you holding the chill of the night long into the day. People rest in the shade. They eat their midday meal. Perhaps they drink a little of the local wine, watered and cool. Beside the great garden in the center of the city, the wide pool lies still and bright, reflecting the cliffs and the sky, and the little pavilion on its island floats in the shimmering light. And to sit near that water in the heat of the day, in a desert city, must have felt like the nearest thing to paradise that the ancient world could offer. Then the long afternoon, and slowly the heat begins to ease, and the shadows begin to lengthen again, now falling the other way, and the light on the facades grows richer and deeper and more golden as the sun slides down the western sky. This, of all the hours, is when Petra is most beautiful. When the low sun sets the whole valley of carved stone ablaze with warm color. Every column and cornice thrown into soft relief. The shadows in the doorways deep and blue. The rows of the rock deepening toward red. The markets do their last brisk business of the day. The caravans that will leave in the cool of the coming night make ready. Friends gather in the doorways of the carved houses to talk over the day. And up on the high places, the evening offerings send their thin threads of fragrant smoke rising into the reddening air. And then the sun touches the western rim of the cliffs and slips behind it, and the valley fills with a soft blue dusk, and the first cooking fires glow warm in the doorways of the houses. The great facades fade from gold to rose to gray, their carved figures dissolving gently into shadow. The heat lifts away entirely, and the desert cold begins to steal down from the heights, and people draw their cloaks around them and move closer to the fires. The sounds of the city soften, one by one. The markets fall quiet. The children are called in, and overhead, in that enormous clear desert sky, the stars come out. First one, and then a scattering, and then a vast blazing multitude of them, spilled from horizon to horizon over the sleeping city. More stars than you could ever hope to count, wheeling slowly above the dark shapes of the mountains and the darker mouths of the silent tombs. The water still runs softly in the channels. The last fire burns low. And Petra, that impossible and beautiful city, carved from the living rock, settles into the deep quiet of the desert night, held safe in its ring of cliffs, exactly as it was held, night after night, for hundreds and hundreds of years. There is so much more of Petra to see than the treasury alone, and though the day we have just spent together has drawn to its close, let us wander a little longer among the monuments themselves, in the timeless way of a dream, where the sun need not rise or set, and we may simply move from wonder to wonder as we please. For along one great wall of the valley, high up where the cliff catches the full light of the day, there stands a row of enormous carved tombs, so grand and so richly worked that they are known as the royal tombs, and it is thought that here, the greatest of the Nabataean kings and queens may have been laid to rest. To stand beneath them and look up is to feel the full ambition of this people made visible in stone. One of these is called the urn tomb, for the great carved vessel that crowns its summit, and it is a mighty work indeed, set high on the mountainside above a broad courtyard, approached by tiers of arches and a wide-open terrace from which the whole valley spreads out below. Its inner chamber is vast, a great hall hollowed from the rock, and in a later age it too was turned into a Christian church, so that within its walls you may see the marks of both the old world and the new. Beside it stands the tomb the Bedouin named the Silk Tomb, and the name is perfect, for the bands of color in its sandstone facade swirl and flow across the rock in ripples of rose and gold and gray and deep red, like folds of shining silk caught forever in the stone. One of the most beautiful natural patterns to be found anywhere in the whole valley. Nearby rise the Corinthian tomb, its worn facade echoing the grand style of the treasury, and the huge palace tomb, whose broad front, built up in places with stacked stone where the cliff itself ran out, was made to resemble the towering facade of a great royal palace, level upon level climbing up the mountainside. Each of these monuments repays long and quiet looking, for the more you gaze at them the more you see the softened figures among the columns, the worn inscriptions, the dark doorways opening into cool and silent chambers, the marks of the tools that shaped them still faintly visible on the rock after 2,000 years. And scattered throughout the rest of the valley are hundreds more, humbler, but no less moving. From the simple step-tops of the oldest tomb designs, carved in the plain style the Nabataeans used before the grand Greek fashions arrived, to modest family graves tucked into every fold and corner of the cliffs. To walk among them all is to walk through the whole long life of a people, their changing tastes and fortunes written across the mountainsides, their reverence for their dead expressed on a scale that few peoples in all of history have ever attempted. And who were they, really, these people whose tombs so fill the valley? Let us try, as we drift toward the end of the night, to see them not as a faceless ancient race, but as living men and women. They were, by all accounts, a handsome and vigorous people. Desert folk grown strong in a hard land, dressed in the flowing robes suited to the extremes of desert heat and cold, adorned, those who could afford it, with jewelry of gold and silver and precious stones brought in along the trade roads. They were famous for their skill and their industry, and famous too among their neighbors, for a certain plainness and equality in their manners. For it was said that even their kings would serve the common people at their feasts and take their turn to wait upon others. A custom that struck the more rigid and hierarchical Greeks as strange and worthy of note. They loved their wine and their music and their great communal banquets. They were, above all, a practical people, clever with their hands and their heads, unromantic in the best sense, more interested in solving the real problems of survival and prosperity than in grand conquests or empty display. We can see their hands most clearly perhaps in their pottery, that exquisite thin painted ware that was one of the marvels of the ancient world. The finest Nabataean cups and bowls were made so delicately, their walls so thin, that they are almost like eggshell, and they were painted with graceful, feathery designs of leaves and flowers and vines in a soft reddish brown. Such pottery was not the work of a rough frontier people, but of skilled and confident artists working at the height of their craft, and it was traded far and wide, carrying the taste of Petra to distant tables. In their writing, too, we can almost hear their voices, for they left thousands of inscriptions carved on the rocks, not only grand royal proclamations, but humble things. A traveler's name scratched beside a desert road, a prayer to Dushara, a note recording who had carved a particular tomb and for whom. Through these small human marks the Nabataeans reach out to us across the centuries, ordinary people wishing, as people always have, to leave some sign that they had passed this way, that they had lived, that they had loved someone and honored their gods and made their mark upon the enduring stone. Petra, for all its splendor, was not alone in the world, and to understand it fully we should remember that it was the crown and capital of a whole far-flung kingdom, a network of towns and outposts and sacred places scattered across the deserts of Arabia and the lands to the north. Far to the south, deep in the Arabian desert in what is now the northwest of Saudi Arabia, the Nabataeans built a second great city of carved tombs, a place now often called by the name Hegra, or by its later Arabic name that means the cities of Salih. There, in isolation among the desert sands, stand scores of magnificent tombs cut into great isolated outcrops of rock, their facades close cousins to those of Petra itself, many of them beautifully preserved by the dry desert air and the remoteness that kept them safe from later builders and looters. To come upon Hegra is to be reminded that the genius we have marveled at all night was not confined to a single valley, but belonged to a whole people who carried their arts of water and stone wherever their kingdom reached. To the north, the Nabataeans held the ancient city of Basra, which would later become a great Roman provincial capital, and they controlled a web of routes and settlements reaching toward Damascus. And out in the dry hills of the Negev, west of their heartland, they founded a string of desert towns, and built there the runoff farms and water systems that let them grow crops and raise vines in country that seemed to offer nothing. All of these places were bound together by the roads and the trade and the shared culture of the Nabataean people, with Petra at the center of it all, the great hidden capital toward which the wealth and the pilgrims and the caravans flowed. When we stand in Petra, then, we are standing at the heart of something much larger than a single city, at the very center of a desert civilization that stretched for many hundreds of kilometers in every direction, and that for a few glorious centuries was one of the quiet marvels of the ancient world. It is worth pausing, too, over the very name by which we know this place, for the name Petra is not what the Nabataeans themselves called their city. The word Petra comes from the Greek, and it means, quite simply, the rock, a fitting name given to the city by the Greek-speaking peoples of the wider ancient world, who saw at once that its whole character was bound up with the living stone from which it was hewn. The Nabataeans, in their own tongue, seem to have called their capital by a different name, one that appears in some of their inscriptions, and that scholars often render as Rakhmu. There is something quietly telling in this small fact. The name that history remembers, the name carved now into every map and guidebook, is the name that outsiders gave the place, the name of the strangers who came from the west and marveled at the city of the rock, the name the Nabataeans used among themselves, the name by which they knew their own beloved home, has very nearly faded from the world, surviving only in a handful of worn inscriptions. It is one more small measure of how completely a people can pass away, when even the name they gave their own city is half forgotten, and we know their greatest achievement chiefly by a word borrowed from those who watched it from the outside. And the roads that bound this kingdom together were, of course, the roads of the caravans, and it is worth pausing to picture that long, slow journey one final time, for it was the very artery through which the life of Petra flowed. Imagine setting out from the far south of Arabia with a load of precious frankincense, the golden resin packed carefully in baskets and slung upon the backs of the camels. Ahead of you lie many weeks of travel across some of the emptiest country on the earth. You move mostly in the cool of the early morning and the evening, resting your animals through the worst heat of the day. You navigate by the stars and by the knowledge, handed down through generations of desert traders, of where the next well or spring or friendly settlement will be found. You are always alert for raiders, who might sweep in to seize a fortune in incense in a single swift attack. And so you travel in company, many merchants and many camels together, for safety in numbers. Day after day the same horizon, the same endless light, the same swaying gait of the camel beneath you, the same rationed sips of warm water. And then, at last, after all those weeks, you come up through the mountains and through the narrow cleft in the cliffs. And there before you opens the sheltered green valley of Petra, with its running water and its markets and its temples, and its promise of rest and safety and trade. Small wonder that the Nabataeans grew rich. They had made themselves the great haven at the end of a terrible road, and every traveler who reached them was glad, beyond words, to pay for what they offered. We have spoken often tonight of tombs, and it is worth stopping, gently, to consider what the Nabataeans believed about death, insofar as we can know it, for their whole city is in a sense a great meditation upon it. They carved their tombs not hidden away out of sight, but out in the open, along the streets and above the squares, their grand facades facing directly onto the places where the living passed their days. The dead, in Petra, were not banished from the city of the living, but remained a part of it, present and honored, their beautiful stone houses standing among the houses of the living as a constant, quiet reminder of those who had gone before. And the Nabataeans came to the tombs of their families not only to bury and to mourn, but to feast. In chambers cut near the graves, they gathered to share meals in the company of their dead, eating and drinking together in the presence of their ancestors, keeping the bond between the generations alive across the threshold of death. There is something deeply moving in this, and something wise. These were people who did not turn their faces from mortality, but built it openly into the very fabric of their city, who honored their dead by keeping them close, and by continuing, quite literally, to share their lives with them. Perhaps this is part of why Petra moves us so, even now, even as a ruin. It was always, from the very beginning, a place where the living and the dead dwelt side by side, where beauty and loss were carved together into the same enduring stone, and where the shortness of a single human life was set, gently and without fear, against the long, long patience of the mountains. From the day that Burckhardt carried its memory back out of the desert, Petra has never again been forgotten. Through the 2 centuries since, its fame has only grown. Until today, it is known and loved around the entire world, one of the most celebrated ancient sites on the face of the earth. Artists came in the early years and painted its glowing facades, and their romantic images of the rose-red city stirred the imagination of a distant public who would never see it with their own eyes. Photographers followed, and then, in our own age, the moving pictures of film, so that the great carved front of the treasury has become one of the most instantly recognized images of the ancient world, glimpsed by countless millions of people who could not tell you the name of a single Nabataean king, but who know, at once, that shape of columns and figures cut into the rose-colored cliff. Petra has been named among the new wonders of the world, and it has been placed upon the roll of humanity's most treasured heritage, protected and studied and cherished as one of the irreplaceable achievements of our species. And why does it hold us so? Why does this particular ruin, of all the many ruins that dot the earth, reach so deeply into the human heart? Part of it, surely, is the sheer astonishing beauty of the thing, the marriage of human artistry and natural splendor, those grand carved fronts glowing in the desert light against the wild, swirling colors of the living stone. Part of it is the drama of the setting, the hidden valley reached through the long, dark canyon, so that the first sight of the treasury comes as a genuine revelation, a gasp of wonder that no photograph can quite prepare you for. But part of it, I think, is the story, the very story we have followed tonight, the story of a great and clever people who rose from nothing in a harsh land, who built a marvel, and who then, slowly and quietly, passed away and were forgotten, leaving their beautiful city to the sand and the silence and the wandering wind. It is the story of the rise and the fall, of glory and of loss, told in a form that we can walk through with our own feet and touch with our own hands. Petra is a place where the deepest truths about time and impermanence are not spoken, but shown, carved into stone that has outlasted the very memory of those who carved it. Yet Petra is not, even now, an entirely dead place, and it is important to remember that too. For all through the long centuries of its forgetting, and right up into modern times, the valley remained home to the Bedouin, the desert people who watered their flocks at its ancient cisterns and sheltered in its carved chambers and kept alive, in their stories and their memory, the presence of the old city. In the modern age, as the world came flooding back to Petra, the lives of these people became bound up once more with the ancient stones as guides and guardians and keepers of the place, their knowledge of the valley reaching back through generations. And so there is a living thread that runs unbroken through the whole vast span of Petra's story, from the Nabataeans who first carved the cliffs, through the long silence of the forgotten centuries, to the people who live in and around the valley today. The city was never quite as empty as the outside world imagined. There were always human eyes to see the sun rise upon the treasury, always human voices, however few, echoing among the tombs. The lantern, if you like, was never entirely extinguished. It only burned very low, through the long night of forgetting, waiting for the world to remember, and to come back, and to see. To visit Petra today is to feel all of these layers of time pressing gently upon you at once. You walk down the same shadowed canyon that the caravans walked, and the Nabataean pilgrims, and Burckhardt in his disguise, and you come out to the same first breathtaking view of the treasury that has stopped travelers in their tracks for 2,000 years. You climb the same rock-cut stairs to the same high places, worn now a little smoother by all the feet that have climbed them since. You run your hand, perhaps, along the cool carved surface of a facade, and feel beneath your fingers the faint marks of the tools of a mason who worked there before the birth of Christ. And in the evening, when the crowds have gone and the low sun sets the whole valley ablaze with color, you can stand in the quiet and feel the enormous weight and depth of all that time, the centuries piled upon centuries, the glory and the fading, and the long sleep and the waking, all of it held here together in this one hidden valley among the rose-red cliffs. It is a humbling thing, and a strangely comforting one. For if this city could pass away so completely and yet endure, if it could be lost for 1,000 years and yet be found again, then perhaps loss is never quite as final as it seems. And perhaps the things that are made with love and patience and genius leave a mark upon the world that even the sand and the centuries cannot entirely erase. There is a particular kind of wonder that belongs only to lost cities, and Petra is perhaps the purest example of it that the world has to offer. Throughout history, human beings have built great cities, and then, for one reason or another, abandoned them, leaving them to the jungle or the desert or the rising sea. And there is something about such places that speaks to us as almost nothing else can. A city that has been continuously lived in for thousands of years, rebuilt again and again, is a wonderful thing. But its ancient layers are buried and built over, hidden beneath the living present. A lost city is different. A lost city is a moment preserved, a whole world stopped in time and handed down to us across the centuries, so that we may walk into the past as into a room that someone left only yesterday, and feel, with an immediacy that no book can give, the presence of the people who once lived there. And of all the lost cities of the world, few are as complete, as beautiful, or as haunting as Petra. Precisely because the desert that swallowed it was also the desert that preserved it, keeping its carved cliffs safe in the dry air through all the long years of its sleep. The desert, in this way, is a strange and paradoxical keeper of the past. It is a destroyer, harsh and unforgiving, capable of killing a traveler in a day and of grinding a proud city slowly down into ruin. And yet it is also a preserver, for its very dryness holds decay at bay, keeping wood and cloth and paper and paint that would have rotted away entirely in a wetter land. The same sands that buried Petra also protected it, drawing a blanket over its monuments and holding them safe from the hands of later builders who might have torn them down for their stone, and from the damp that would have crumbled them until the day the world was ready to uncover them again. There is a lesson in this too, perhaps, about the strange ways in which loss and preservation can be woven together, about how the very forces that seem to bury and end things may also, unknowingly, be keeping them safe for a future that no one alive at the time could have imagined. The Nabataeans, as they faded from their valley, could not have dreamed that the sand which was swallowing their city would one day give it back, whole and wondrous, to a world they could never have conceived of. And yet that is exactly what happened. The city slept, and the desert kept it, and in time it woke. And so we return, at the very end, to the great and simple theme that is run beneath everything we have spoken of tonight. The theme of what passes and what remains. Every human life is short. Every human being who ever walked the streets of Petra, from the greatest king in his palace tomb to the humblest water carrier in the crowded market, lived a life that came and went in a span of years, and then was gone. The kingdom itself, mighty as it seemed to those who lived within it, lasted only a few centuries before the tide of history carried it away. Even the city of stone, which must have felt as permanent as the mountains to those who built it, faded and fell and was forgotten. Nothing, it seems, endures. And yet, here we are, 2,000 years later, on the far side of the world from that desert valley, and we are speaking of them still. Their carved facades still stand and still catch the morning light. Their clever water channels are still studied and admired. Their flowing script still lives on, transformed, in the writing of a great part of humankind. The mark they made upon the world, made with such patience and such love and such genius, is still here, still teaching us, still moving us, still able to reach across all those centuries and touch the heart of a stranger lying quietly in the dark, a world and an age away. Let us give a last thought, before we close, to the hands that made all of this. For it is easy to speak of a carved city as though it simply appeared, and to forget the long, patient human labor that lay behind every single facade. Somewhere in the story of Petra there were the masons, the carvers, the ordinary skilled workers who spent their lives shaping the rock, and we know almost nothing about them. And yet without them, there would be nothing here at all. Picture one of them, a carver in the golden age of the city, rising before dawn and climbing to his work high on a cliff face, where a great tomb front is slowly taking shape out of the raw stone. He has perhaps inherited his craft from his father, who learned it from his father before him, a chain of knowledge stretching back through the generations, each one adding a little to the skill of the whole. He works with simple iron tools, a chisel and a mallet, and with an eye trained by long years to see the finished shape hidden within the rough rock, and to bring it out, stroke by careful stroke. He begins at the top, as we have learned, cutting away the cliff face from above, and working downward, standing on ledges cut into the stone or on wooden scaffolding lashed against the cliff, the whole valley spread out dizzyingly beneath him. It is slow work, and dangerous, and it demands total concentration, for a single careless blow in the soft sandstone can ruin a curve that took days to shape, and there is no repairing it, no starting over. And yet he works on, hour after hour, day after day, month after month, the dust of the rock coating his skin and filling the creases of his hands, the sun beating on his back, the shape of a column, or a capital, or the softened face of a god emerging, with agonizing slowness, from the living cliff beneath his tools. He may not live to see the great tomb finished. Some of these monuments took years to complete, and a carver might give the better part of his working life to a single facade, knowing that others would carry on the work after him, and that his own small contribution would vanish, indistinguishable, into the finished whole. There is a deep humility in that kind of labor, a willingness to pour one's skill and one's strength into a thing greater than oneself, a thing that will outlast one by centuries, without any expectation that one's own name will be remembered. And it is precisely this anonymous, patient, generous labor, multiplied across countless workers and countless years, that built the wonder we have wandered through tonight. Every graceful column, every softened figure, every clean-cut doorway in that valley of rose-red stone is the sum of thousands upon thousands of individual blows of a chisel, each one struck by a real human hand, each one a small act of skill and care, offered up to a work whose completion the maker might never see. When we stand before the great facades of Petra, we are standing before the assembled labor of generations of forgotten craftsmen, and there is no finer monument to the quiet, steady, unglamorous work that truly builds the wonders of the world. And so their city stands, still, after everything. The kings are dust, and the caravans are gone, and the language of the market has fallen silent. But the work of those patient hands endures, glowing in the desert light, exactly where they left it. It is, in the end, a strangely hopeful thing to consider, as the night grows deep around you. For it tells us that the care we put into our work, the patience and the love we bring to the things we make, need not be lost, even when we ourselves are gone. It can outlast us by an age. It can speak, long after we are silent, to people we will never meet, in times we cannot imagine. The carvers of Petra could not have known that a stranger, 2,000 years later, would be moved by the beauty of what they made. But they are, and so it was not for nothing. Nothing made with real care is ever quite for nothing. We have spoken of the gods of Petra, of Dushara, the lord of the mountain, and of the goddess who stood beside him, and of the plain stone pillars in which the Nabataeans first found the presence of the divine. But to understand how faith truly lived in this city, we must imagine not the quiet shrine on an ordinary day, but the great festivals. The high holy days when the whole city gave itself over to the worship of its gods, for it was then that the deepest life of the Nabataean spirit rose to the surface and filled the valley with sound and color and smoke. On such a day, the ordinary business of the markets would fall away, and the people would gather in their finest dress. And a great procession would form to make its way through the city and up toward the sacred heights. Picture that procession now, winding through the streets in the golden morning light. At its head come the priests in their robes, carrying the sacred emblems of the god, and behind them the images or the holy stones borne with great reverence, and behind those, the musicians, with pipes and drums and the rhythmic clashing of bronze, filling the canyon walls with echoing music. The people follow in their crowds, singing, carrying offerings of incense and grain, and the first fruits of their flocks and fields. The sweet smoke of frankincense, the very substance on which the city's wealth was built, rises in thick clouds along the way, so that the whole procession moves within a fragrant haze. And the rose-red cliffs look down upon a river of color and sound, flowing slowly through the heart of the hidden city. And then the long climb begins, up the hundreds of rock-cut steps toward the high place of sacrifice on the mountain's summit. The procession ascends slowly, the music growing thinner in the wide air, the city falling away below, until at last the worshippers come out onto that broad-leveled platform open to the enormous sky, where the altars wait, cut from the living stone. There the offerings are made, the sacrifices given, the prayers of the whole community lifted up to Dushara, and to the powers that govern their lives and their harvests, and the fortunes of their trade. And from that great height, the people could look out over the whole of their world, the ringed valley and the carved cliffs, and the endless desert stretching away to the shimmering horizon, and feel themselves gathered up, for a moment, into something far larger than any single life, bound to their gods and to their ancestors and to one another by the ancient rhythms of the festival. It was in such moments, perhaps, more than in any building of stone, that the Nabataeans were most fully themselves, a people held together not only by trade and by water, but by a shared reverence, a shared wonder, a shared sense of the sacred dwelling in the high and silent places of their beautiful and difficult land. And when the rites were done, they would descend again, slowly, back down the long stairways into the valley, back to the markets and the houses and the ordinary days, carrying with them the quiet strength that such gatherings have always given to the people who share in them. And now our long journey is nearly done, and it is time to let the story, and the day, and every last small weight you may still be holding, gently come to rest. So let your mind wander back, one final time, to that hidden valley among the mountains of the desert. There is no need to follow every thread of all that we have spoken of tonight. Let the kings and the caravans and the earthquakes and the explorers blur softly together, the way the details of the day blur softly together as you drift toward sleep. Keep only the feeling of the place, the warmth of the rose-colored stone, the coolness of the carved chambers, the soft and constant sound of running water, and the enormous quiet of the desert night settling over it all. Picture yourself once more at the entrance to the city, in the cool blue hour, walking slowly down the winding canyon. The walls rise high on either side, banded with their swirling colors, leaning gently together far overhead. Your footsteps are soft in the sand. The air is still and cool against your face. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, but walk, slowly, through the glowing rock, following the gentle curves of the canyon deeper and deeper into the mountain, each bend revealing only the next quiet stretch of stone, each step carrying you further from the noise of the world and deeper into the calm at the heart of the hills. And when at last you come to the narrow slot at the end and step through it, there before you stands the great carved front of the treasury, glowing softly in the first light, patient and beautiful and utterly at peace, as it has stood through 20 centuries of mornings, waiting for no one, needing nothing, simply being, in the quiet, in the light. Let that image hold you, and as it does, let this be the gentle thought you carry down into sleep. The people who made this place lived their lives, as you live yours, full of cares and labors and hopes and fears that felt at the time like the most important things in all the world. And all of it passed. The whole vast busy life of the city, the trading and the building and the worshipping and the worrying, all of it flowed by like water in the channels and drained away into the sand of time. And yet, what remains is not the worry and the striving. What remains is the beauty. What remains is the care that patient hands poured into the stone. What remains is the wonder that a person feels, even now, standing quietly before something made long ago with love and skill. The small anxieties of those ancient lives are gone entirely, forgotten utterly, as though they had never been. But the beauty endured. And perhaps there is a quiet comfort in that for you, tonight, as you lie here in the dark. Perhaps the things that feel so heavy and so urgent just now will, in their own time, drain away as gently as all the cares of Petra drained away, leaving behind only what truly mattered. Only the moments of beauty and kindness and love. Only the things made and done with care. Perhaps you can set the heaviness down, just for tonight, and trust the slow, patient turning of time to carry it away. There is nothing you must solve before you sleep. There is nothing you must decide, nothing you must hold on to, nothing you must fear to let go of. The city stood for 2,000 years without your worry, and it will stand a while yet. The stars wheeled over the desert long before you were born, and they will wheel over it long after. And there is a deep and gentle peace to be found in remembering how small our troubles truly are against the vast and patient background of time. You are one quiet life among the countless lives that have looked up at those same stars, and that is not a lonely thought, but a comforting one, for it means you may lay your burdens down, knowing that the great slow world will keep turning, gently, without any need of your watchfulness through the night. So let your breathing slow now, and let it deepen. Let your body grow heavy and warm, and still, sinking softly into the quiet. Let the last images of the rose-red city fade gently into darkness, the great facades dissolving into shadow, the running water growing faint, the desert stars blurring and softening overhead. Let the whole valley grow quiet, and dim, and far away. There is nothing left to do tonight, but rest. The lantern is burning low. The story is told. The city sleeps in its ring of cliffs, safe and silent under the wheeling stars, as it has slept through so many thousand nights before this one. And now you may sleep too, as deeply and as peacefully as the ancient valley itself, carried down gently into the dark and the quiet, and the rest that you have more than earned. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Lanternlight Chronicles. If you are still awake, you may let these words simply fade, and follow the story down into sleep whenever you are ready. And if you should find yourself awake again on some other night, looking for something calm to carry you toward rest, I will be here, and there will be another long and gentle story waiting, and another lost world to wander through together in the dark. Until then, from the hidden valley of the rose-red city and the vast quiet of the desert stars, I wish you nothing but stillness and comfort and peace. Rest now. Let everything be quiet. And I wish you a calm and peaceful night.